Polanski.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, Martin.
Good morning.
I just want to explore a few of the things you've said. Now, I'm aware that you're not here for me to scrutinise you in that sense, but there were a couple of things where you thought, I was like, oh, I'm not sure about this. So this is all with the caveat that I've spoken to a lot of firefighters recently, many of whom I think would be described potentially by this frame as serial complainers.
Yes.
Now, I imagine you've probably spoken to a lot more firefighters than I have, but the group that have come to me have largely been self-selecting because they've seen me asking questions on this committee. And when you said serial complainers, I was thinking from the conversations I've had with them, particularly with the people of colour, I imagine their argument would be if you are institutionally racist as an organisation and the structural issues are there, they're already unequal.
Yes.
And you complain, and then your complaint is not dealt with appropriately because of the structural issues, then what options do you have other than to be a serial complainer if the issue is structural? And then on top of that, that's then compounded that if you've then complained about a manager and then you go above their head, they might have sympathy for your view, but eventually that will keep going up. And then they have a choice. They can either say 5 people underneath you have all made mistakes and we've got to adjust the culture entirely, or you can demonise or exercise this one person and paint them out as a serial complainer and have them pushed out. So, yeah, I just want to challenge, I suppose, this phrase serial complainer.
Well, as I said, the ones that have come, because my email's in the public domain, so you can get to me without going through LFB, which I don't mind at all. But there are certain names, and when I was a Judicial Appointments Commissioner, there were certain members of the Bar and Solicitors who would fail to be appointed to be judges, and they would threaten to judicially review the Judicial Appointments Commission. They would find fault in process, etc. I'm not wishing to diminish the importance of the complaints, but there have been instances to my eye, and this is very much a lawyer's perspective, where the same thing is being said 3 or 4 different ways. And it doesn't seem that anything that's done, whether it's moving stations, changing positions, making sure people don't work together, who don't get on, is ever going to fully satisfy that individual. But I don't dismiss those lightly. I'm fully aware that there are still some issues with PSU. I'm giving it a chance because it's new. It's not fully staffed. As a regulatory lawyer, that's the bit of it that I think most interests me, in the sense that I think if you've got to have a disciplinary process which is transparent and fair and accepted as such by firefighters, if they don't trust the process, and I think this is what you're really getting to, if you feel that your complaints are not taken seriously, or if you feel that a complaint made against you has resulted in more serious action than if it had been made against somebody else, or if you feel the threshold for referring you or taking out a grievance against you or making a complaint against you is lower because you have a protected characteristic than somebody who doesn't, then that's a serious problem. And I'm pretty confident, particularly from what came out of our very last meeting, that everybody on the panel is going to hold LFB's feet to the fire on that, because that is one area where I ought to be able to come back and say to you, the average time length of suspension was this, we've cut it by 50%, or the number of complaints, the time it takes from a complaint to be made to its resolution has also been shortened. We are now getting granular information as to whether a disproportionate number of women or non-white firefighters are finding themselves referred than their white British counterparts. I mean, I agree with you, and very happy to work with you on this, and very happy to speak to any of the groups that you've met. That absolutely central, it seems to me, to our work is to help the fire brigade come up with a fair, transparent, and consistent disciplinary process, because that's something that certainly the doctors I represent complain about. They'll say GPs get struck off when consultants don't, because the consultants can call their medical director, their clinical director, say they're wonderful surgeons, whereas the GP, the attitude may be, well, they get another GP, or the other GPs in the practice will just have to take on their patients. So they sometimes feel they're seen as more dispensable, and I think I think you're right to query that.
That's really clear. Something else you said earlier on was that the PSU had a degree of independence, which I'd agree with, but within that degree, then there's a degree of absolutely not being independent. Isn't that incommensurate, essentially, with people wanting to have trust in the process? That if you're complaining about the process, but then you feel like it's not fully independent, then there's an issue there.
I mean, it depends. I certainly don't think that LFB should be able to mark their own homework, and it seems to me that ultimately there needs to be, whether it's through an appellate process or any other process, a pretty high degree of independence. One of the issues with, well, there are two issues, I'd say, with something that's wholly independent, is that I feel that within process you do need to have somebody who knows what the day-to-day work of a firefighter is and what the standards are. So I wouldn't know that because I'm not a firefighter. So if you said KCs decide all disciplinary actions in LFB, then there might be something technical that I don't understand. So I think you do need some input. The other problem with full independence is the expense. And when I did the Labour Party report, I didn't want the National Executive Committee anywhere near the disciplinary process, but they guarded that very jealously. And I wanted full independence, whereas they were selecting a panel of lawyers. And sometimes when you look at the lawyers that are selected by institutions, they already come with a view of that institution. So I, for instance, would have thought that if you've got independent lawyers, you probably wouldn't want, if it was a political party, a party member, for instance. But the parties do like to recruit people who are also supporters for roles that I don't think are independent enough. So you're absolutely right. I think the more independence, and it's an independence balance against cost that's brought to the PSU and its decision making, the better. I think that the recruitment of people into the PSU needs to be fair and transparent, and I would certainly argue against having people. You're going to need some people in the PSU who understand the day-to-day life of a firefighter, but certainly the LFP will need to be scrupulous that there's no personal connection between any decision makers. This is something that's come up within PSU, and either the complainant or the person being complained of. And you need proper Chinese walls. If you've got a social relationship with somebody who's in the frame, as it were, then the complainant needs to know you're not going to treat them more leniently because you've been on holiday with them. It's that sort of thing that it seems to me that just simply can't happen.
Absolutely. In the Labour Party report, the Ford report, obviously, you talk about not having factional allegiances, and this isn't a party political point. As a deputy leader of a national party, I'm aware that every political party has problems with its disciplinary process. But again, it feels that I understand the point about that someone has to understand the day-to-day process, but if there's someone who understands the day-to-day process enough that the senior leadership of the London Fire Brigade goes, they're good enough to go on the professional standards union.
Yes.
Could that not be argued that's already a factional allegiance because they have gained enough notoriety, or notoriety is the wrong word, enough prestige to go, you're good enough or you are trusted enough to represent us on this board, that is already demonstrating an allegiance to the leadership?
It could do, but as I said, I think if you're fair and transparent about your recruitment, you want to diminish the possibility of recruiting people along factional lines. And I'm certainly aware that the Commissioner has been approached directly by firefighters in a disciplinary context, and he's been scrupulous about saying, I'm sorry, I cannot get involved until the process has been completed. Very happy to meet you after that, but I'm massively conflicted. If you want me to start going into PSU and saying I've had a complaint from Mr. Polanski, who's at Camden Station, what's going on? I'm taking a personal interest. You'll recall again, coming out to the Labour Party report, there was a suggestion that might be, Mr. Corbyn's interested in this one or something along those lines, being a hint that he might want a particular outcome. You'll know I didn't find any direct interference in that sense in individual cases, but you've got to guard against that potential for tainting of process. And as I said, I think the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioners are very, very aware of that. And I'm aware that they do get approached sometimes, at meetings which are not about the disciplinary process by people who are unhappy about PSU. And I think that one of the refinements that might be needed is who deals with a complaint against somebody who's part of PSU. Can that be dealt with by PSU, or does it have to go to another independent, separate body? Because I don't think we've quite got to the stage of working that out.
Yeah, that feels...
I don't know who would discipline the commissioner, for instance, because he's not line managed by anybody. So whether that would have to be bringing in a commissioner from another fire brigade, for instance, because I mean that sometimes happens with lawyers. If they find themselves in the criminal court, they won't be tried where they know the judges or the area in which they practice.
Yeah, that feels like really important questions. This concept of taught how to behave. So before as a politician, I used to work at the Justice Assessment Committee, and I know that a huge issue there around recruiting future judges was around having enough flexibility around culture to not assume that certain behaviours were inappropriate in certain work contexts. So someone, for instance, who raises their voice in one culture, it can perfectly not be being aggressive.
Or doesn't look somebody in the eye. So my culture, my father, if he was telling me off, if I looked him in the eye, he would see that as an act of defiance.
Right.
I was always taught to look at the ground. And there does need to be that cultural awareness and sensitivity. I mean, within the judiciary, there's an equal treatment book, there's a bench book, and so we were taught. I sat as a part-time judge in the Crown Court, and so we were taught about various customs and traditions, how people take the oath, how to address people, and you'll recall there was a bit of controversy about whether witnesses could be fully veiled and give evidence, and that sort of thing. So again, I'll be looking to see if there is anything written in terms of procedures and protocols for any panellist, it seems to me as well, that's sitting in judgment of a firefighter in a disciplinary context needs also to be culturally aware, it seems to me.
Brilliant. So when we say teaching people how to behave, that's teaching people how to behave if they're coming with inappropriate behaviours. So that's nothing to do with culture. That's misogyny, sexism, racism, etc. But where people are coming from a certain culture where that might not have been the traditional culture in the fire brigade having some agility or flexibility to be able to incorporate different behaviours within a wide spectrum of appropriateness.
Well, yeah, and I think they're working quite hard on that. I mean, one of the interesting issues talking to firefighters was neurodiversity.
Right.
Now, there was one gentleman who's very vociferous about this, saying, you know, we can't rely upon people who are neurodiverse. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, because I have a friend who's got a high-achieving autistic son who has memorised the whole of the tube map, and he knows every single bus route. That's the person I'd want on ropes. That's the person I'd want on safety equipment. So it's adjusting that attitude. And I did feel he backed down when I said to him I felt it was more our lack of understanding of neurodiversity, that we were on catch-up, not the neurodiverse person. And we ended up, I felt, having a pretty balanced conversation about it. I said, so, you know, you've got to work to people's strengths. You know, and so for instance, there was a time when, certainly in training, it was said that they might make a female firefighter deal with a very, very heavy piece of equipment in order to try and ridicule them about their physical strength. Well, that's completely unacceptable. But then the person in that situation needs an ally. And I think it's also about telling the recruits, you need to speak up. You must also speak truth to power. If you're not happy with somebody senior ridiculing another more junior person, then you need to be confident there's somewhere that you can go to make that complaint.
Thank you. And then my final question, it's not an easy question, but is this concept of hierarchies of oppression, and I ask this question as a Jewish man that feels that there is hierarchies of oppression often in society, and you know, if we look at a political scenario, it feels like Islamophobia often gets treated in different ways than other racism. How does an organisation tackle that, and crucially, how do you make sure that each individual in that organisation recognises that there's kind of a flat structure in terms of every oppression is dealt as an oppression that's unacceptable?
Oh, that's a philosophical question. I think it has to be around leadership. I think it also has to be around constant education. And I am quite interested in in things around scenarios and workshops, because certainly for my judicial training, we would have a mock trial where lots of things went wrong and lots of behaviours were appalling, and that could be a witness, it could be a judge. And then we were asked, how would you deal with that situation? And I think there is room, and definitely in the training process, to emphasise over and over again that what the Fire Brigade are trying to achieve is an environment where people are looking forward to going to work and feel that they're in a supported environment. Because if that's the environment they operate in, they'll be far more effective firefighters. You know, you can't have personalities and personal clashes coming in the way of firefighting. And then one of Mrs. Hall mentioned that the police, I mean, the one advantage the Fire Brigade have is that they are perceived by the public in a pretty favourable way. So they start from a good place because we're all very grateful to them for their bravery. But we've also got to guard against the kind of hero complex, because sometimes people think behaviours are acceptable because they're braver than other people. But on the other hand, I had a firefighter complaining that his daughter had been ridiculed at school and told that her father hadn't been brave at Grenfell, when in fact he'd been incredibly brave. So there are these competing aspects, but culture is a very, very nebulous thing. But I think the more often people are told within the fire service, these are the behaviours we expect, these are the values. I mean, you see them up in every fire station. I don't think people are paying lip service to them, and certainly, as I said, at the senior level, I think there's a real desire to get this right, but it's just making sure it's really embedded right the way through the service, which, as Mrs. Hall said, I think will take time.
Thank you. That's all really helpful. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. That's an interesting set of questions there.